The heavily forested region of Chiapas in southern Mexico is home to about 5 million people, one of the highest concentrations of diverse plant and animal species in the world, and a sprawling anarchist community which has managed to gain de facto autonomy from the Mexican state. This is Byron with Springtime of Nations, and today, the Neo-Zapatista movement. To understand the Neo-Zapatistas, one must not overlook the importance of Mexican history. Before we get into the eponymous Zapata, let us look towards the conditions that made the Mexican people turn to him in the first place. The social conditions of Mexico that gave rise to Emilio Zapata and his followers were largely created by Porfirio Diaz, his importance to Mexican history immortalized as the years encompassing his 6 terms as president, 1876 to 1911, known as the Porfiriato, which was characterized by government favoritism towards the technocratic científicos, foreign investors, and the hacendados, landowners, over the campesinos, tenant farmers. As Diaz pursued yet another term in 1910, a wealthy liberal by the name of Francisco Ignacio Madero threw his hat into the presidential race and drew support from the peasantry of Mexico. He was unashamedly imprisoned by Diaz supporters and the police during Election Day. Diaz was soon declared winner after the polls closed. Madero's defeat ended with him escaping to Texas and writing the Plan of San Luis Potosi, which called for armed revolution against the Diaz regime. At first, there was hardly a movement to be identified, but soon after Madero incorporated land reform into his platform, that changed. Various leaders of rebel bands pledged themselves to Madero, and soon Diaz had to put out fires in both the north and south of Mexico. Throughout this process, Emilio Zapata emerged as one of the most important figures of the revolution, both through military victories and luck. Being used often as a mediator and having recognizability, both the government and the rebels began to look to him as a symbol of the campesinos. Madero eventually succeeded in ousting Diaz and allowed an interim president to take over for a year. The next election, Madero won with 90% of the vote. Soon, however, he would see how his promises meant something different to the peasantry. Madero's assurance that land titles would be rightfully returned through the court of law fell on deaf ears. Madero repeatedly called for the rebels to turn in their arms. The victory had already arrived. Zapata, however, was extremely distrustful of the new president and demanded swift reform. Despite Madero trying to reel Huerta in, Zapata was convinced that there could be no more negotiation. He drafted the Plan of Ayala, which said, "That to the pueblos there be given what in justice they deserve, as to lands, timber, and water, which has been the origin of the present counter-revolution," and the removal of Madero. This was followed by Madero's defeat by the United Revolutionary Forces of Zapata, Pancho Villa, and Venustiano Carranza. By 1917, the now President Carranza drafted the new constitution, utilizing aspects of Zapata's Plan de Ayala. This was no doubt an attempt to finally quell the rebellions that had plagued Mexico through the presidency of multiple men and claimed thousands of Mexican lives. This was not enough, and Carranza continued his campaign to eliminate Zapata, eventually succeeding in his assassination. Yet, land reform was codified in the new constitution and would soon be followed by the government giving out land holdings to the indigenous communities for decades to come. The new constitution was written with the purpose of quelling the rebellion of the laborers, and as such contains many concessions to their demands. The most pertinent article here is Article 27. The first line reads, "The property of all land and water within the national territory is originally owned by the nation, who has the right to transfer this ownership to particulars. Hence, private property is a privilege created by the nation." The way land was distributed was through ejidos, a concept of property that can be tied back to Aztec traditions. Communally held and legally protected even under Spanish rule, it was not a practice that was buried with time. It is worth noting that before his death, Zapata had already begun applying his revolutionary Plan de Ayala in his home state of Morelos. It is generally accepted that the land redistribution that took place on the federal level was below what Zapata would have expected, but just enough to shake off rebels. Mexican presidents would be judged by their efforts to make Article 27 come to its end goal, or their efforts to impede it. After decades of poor governance and corruption, by the 1960s, production from the ejidos began to fall below what was needed for the country. Imports of food increased, and ejidos were considered failures. Debates both for and against privatization began to rise, opponents pointing to the fact that ejidos had been located on poor land and exposed the peasantry to corruption both from within the ejidos and without. Proposed solutions ranged from the creation of an association ranging from private citizens to businesses that would assist in renting ejido land, to increased autonomy to full privatization. President Carlos Salinas de Gortari was the president when the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was first drafted in the 1990s, and his decision to jump into such an agreement has colored the Mexican population's opinion of him to this day. The signing of NAFTA was the match that lit the powder keg of Mexico once more. The invitation of multinational corporations to import their products and to claim vast swaths of formerly collectivized land to rent out to workers was irredeemable to a southern Mexican militant group formed in the 1980s, named the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, whose core tenet was anti-globalism. On January 1, 1994, 3,000 armed insurgents seized multiple towns and cities in the state of Chiapas. Armed clashes continued until a ceasefire on the 12th. The Neo-Zapatistas had support within the Catholic Church, as liberation theology was a shared idea among some members of both groups. Though the Mexican government tried a counteroffensive in 1995, it was wildly unpopular and diplomacy was favored. Here, Subcomandante Marcos, seen by many as the face, albeit concealed by a mask, of the movement, revealed his pacifistic inclinations and reacted favorably to peace talks. President Vicente Fox, upon being elected in 2001, tried to negotiate once more with the Neo-Zapatistas, but talks fell through, and the insurgents created various autonomous territories in the state of Chiapas. The influence of the Neo-Zapatistas remained consistently high for a decade, celebrating a long period of autonomy. The EZLN, Zapatista Army of National Liberation, began with a military assault in order to establish its territory, but it had been described as a peaceful movement since then. They carry weapons in order to defend themselves, calling back for the common defense of the ejidos. Terrorist attacks by leftist movements have occurred in Mexico, though many that occurred during the Neo-Zapatistas' rise were committed by the Popular Revolutionary Army, a Maoist group, in contrast to EZLN's libertarianism. The governmental structure of the Neo-Zapatistas is democratic in nature, and though this can often lend itself to mob rule, members of the autonomous zones are given the freedom to leave. Political offices are rotated with terms being fairly short as 2 weeks, creating a system that emphasizes community loyalty over individual power grabs. The economy is largely communal. Private property is non-existent within the autonomous zones. However, the regions do export to other nations, mostly Mexico, and they use the money made to fund public goods such as healthcare, education, loans, or radio stations. Education is particularly democratic, drawing upon a system composed of community input and low or non-existent importance on grading. This system is similar to anarchist ideas during the free thought movement in the United States, though writings on the topic are present wherever anarchists can be found. The current president, Andrés Manuel López de Obrador, was once a vocal critic of Neo-Zapatistas, but when they announced intent to claim more land, he stated it was fine so long as violence was not involved. Many of the Neo-Zapatistas' beliefs and practices, from a libertarian perspective, seem to be contrary to the basic tenets of liberty and individuality. It is important to remember that in the indigenous culture, of which they draw much inspiration for their structures, such as the concepts of Ichbal Tamuk, which implies a collective heart, this is a matter of course. We have no goal to romanticize these pieces of their organization as indigenism against the neocolonialist view that pervades the Latin American region, even within their own sphere of influence, such as in Pulho. Dissatisfaction grows within the neo-Zapatista modes of organization, as much of the population has moved out of the regions. Beyond this, it is difficult to say much more about the dealings within the neo-Zapatista politics, due to the fact that they are very secretive about their systems to outsiders. It can be seen as a Marxist movement, though Subcomandante Marcos refuses to label it as such. They prefer to leave it open so as to be utilized by movements across the world, free to be added to by cultures rather than a rigid set of rules for governance. Though it is an anti-capitalist movement, they have received criticism from communism over their usage of wage labor and their lack of interest in abolishing money. It's worth noting that NAFTA has not delivered what was promised to Mexico, with its growth slowing below most Latin American countries and being explicitly tied to the U.S. economy. Fears expressed by the neo-Zapatistas decades before. Beyond their vast political appeal due to the flexibility of theory, the implementation of liberation theology also allows them to invite the support of Christians. Libertarians should not compromise their positions in order to gain larger mass appeal. The neo-Zapatistas did not compromise any of their beliefs. Rather, they simply reached them from various starting points, allowing them to appeal to Catholics, socialists, anarchists, autonomists, agrarianists, and more. This flexibility without compromise has the potential to be a powerful tool, as various leftist groups will still look to the Zapatista rebellion for inspiration. Right libertarians would do well to analyze what ideas beyond economic function inspire such a lasting impression on people. After all, it was not so long ago that the spirit of revolution was tied to classical liberalism. But if you tell this to a modern leftist, they would simply disbelieve it. Here at Springtime of Nations, we intend to re-spark the truly revolutionary nature of freedom for all nations. Long live the neo-Zapatistas, and may 1,000 flowers bloom.
Ay, hermano mexicano, cuánta penumbra te acecha. Ay, hermano mexicano, cuánta penumbra te acecha. El retroceso mortal, haber optado a derecha. El retroceso mortal, haber optado a derecha. Y no es que sea alternativa la izquierda domesticada, y no es que sea alternativa la izquierda domesticada, pero la opresión injusta pronto verás duplicada, pero la opresión injusta pronto verás duplicada.